Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Farrah Jarral. I've just been introduced, so thank you, Grace. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel discussion, Access to Psychedelic Medicines, So Close Yet So Far. And indeed, the prospect of radical new treatments for mental health disorders does seem to be on the horizon, tantalizingly close. And the huge wave of optimism and excitement does quite rightly need to be counterbalanced with appropriate caution. But at the same time, it does seem a little jarring that here in the UK, currently, psilocybin remains a Class A drug, rubbing shoulders with crack cocaine and heroin, punishable by up to 7 years in prison for possession alone, while at the same time, we are witnessing this global flourishing of scholarship around the potential therapeutic benefits of some of these drugs. So our panelists today have between them a formidable amount of expertise covering everything from drug development to grappling with policy. And I'd love to begin with David, if that's all right. So, David, your research at Imperial College has been promising, fascinating. And I'd love to know how the current legal status of psilocybin in the UK impacts your ability to actually do your work.
Yeah, so this is a more classic question to David, not in a way, and he would have a lot to say on this topic because also his involvement in drug science, a lot of important work in that aspect. I would say very sort of down to earth in a very practical, concrete way, doing the work we are doing in an academic institution when it comes to not the classification but the scheduling. The Schedule 1 does give some challenges. You need specific home office licenses. That takes a while. There are not that many lab doing human works who have that access. So, but for the ones who have, like us, who have been doing this work for more than a decade, we are set up to do it. It works okay. We have the license. We need to pay something every year. We need to have a specific safe that's bolted into the wall and so on. All that is unpractical. Some labs setting it up, there are a lot of requirements to how that safety is. They might have to restructure the whole lab, which is a big headache. I also know from some of the younger, smaller companies in the space that they struggle to set this up. It's costly, complicated. But once it's set up, it kind of works. It's a bit paradoxical and strange that these drugs are scheduled higher than crack and heroin and so on in the scheduling system. So there's a lot of meaning in thinking about reevaluating and rescheduling, also because per definition, they don't have medicinal purpose when they're in this category. And obviously the data coming out, still early stage, but looks like that's wrong. So it should be rethought. But I would say day to day in what we're doing in a lab like ours, when we have the access, it works. And it wouldn't be completely massive change if it was rescheduled for our work right now. But for other people coming into the space, more people getting access to do the research, more competition would be great, and more people getting access to study these drugs. So it would have a lot of positive impact. I think some downstream effects as well, when it comes to sending them across, sending drugs across, getting people to sign off paperwork. I think that the scheduling, the stigma coming from that as well, make these people worried and slow down processes that would probably also be overcome and speed things up if it was rescheduled. That's more a secondary effect of it. And I think that does hit us. Sometimes we get really delayed because stuff are stuck, paperwork, drugs being stuck, different stages, probably also due to the scheduling. And that could be overcome by rethinking that and rescheduling.
So a heavyweight centre like Imperial is managing to get by despite those restrictions while you're having some slowing down. But it sounds like there might be some stifling of basic research that could be happening in smaller centres.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do also actually suffer, but more those downstream effects when a drug gets stuck somewhere in Northern Ireland I'm pretty sure that has to do with the way they're scheduled, that these things become really complicated. People are scared of signing off things, and then suddenly we are burning off funds to run a trial because we can't get started because of some of those obstacles that it keeps on surprising how many things can block it. And I think a lot of that actually more secondary have to do with scheduling.
Thank you. Guy, we've spoken before about the huge wave of public interest and enthusiasm around the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. and the calls for fast tracking of these medicines to become more available. But what do you think are the pitfalls of this level of hype? And could we end up back where we were when psychedelics were first made illegal?
Well, to your second part of your question, yes. So I take a rather conventional view of this. And before I start, I should just say, if I make forward-looking statements about psilocybin, I refer you to Compass's submissions to the SEC, which cover some of the risks which still exist of its development. Our position has really been that we should take a regulatory route, which merely means playing by the existing rules on the grounds that really changing them can be pretty difficult, almost impossible. That means we've set out with accepting that we're going to have to do the kind of regulatory studies that were described in the previous talk, actually. And they're very, very demanding. They cost a lot of money. And the scheduling issue increases those costs and increases the delays, but it doesn't actually stop us doing the studies. So I think for us, the hype is not particularly helpful. It has a number of effects. One is, I think, the one that I'm most concerned about is it bids up patient expectations, and it increases the potential for disappointment because, even in our phase 2 study, the response rates at 3 weeks were between 35 and 40%. They were not 80 to 90%. And these are patients who've had a lot of treatment failure, so they come into the studies really often seeing this as a sort of last chance, although I would always encourage people not to see this treatment in that way, but there is a tendency for that to happen. And so, you don't really want that kind of background expectation to color the patient experience. And finally, just to notice, that sometimes it's hard to appreciate, clinical trials are not the same as clinical practice. They're rather harsher. They're played by more difficult rules for patients, and they absolutely have to give informed consent. And you just don't want their consent to be colored by the kind of hype, the enthusiasm that I think results from sort of Michael Pollan effect. So that's kind of the way we see it.
Thank you. And Compass Pathways recently led the world's first phase 3 clinical trials for psilocybin in depression.
Phase 2.
Phase 2, beg your pardon.
I'd love to, if you're right, to say phase 3.
Can you tell us a bit more about where you're at with that research and what kind of timeline you might envision for access to these drugs on the market? And perhaps pushing this a bit further, when might I, as a British GP, be able to refer my patients for this kind of treatment?
Right, we're really into forward-looking statements now. We completed the phase 2 that we were very happy with the results. We've had the necessary end of phase 2 meetings with the FDA, and we now have a phase 3 program which has been launched and is recruiting patients in 2 large international studies, the first of which is largely conducted in the US, actually, but the other one will be multi-country. The implications of that are that we are very focused on just that program because of the costs. We expect the first of these studies, which is a placebo-controlled study done for safety. We know that it will be unblinding, that's inevitable. That study we hope expect will read out in mid-2024. That's an important catalytic event for us. We expect good things to come from that, but I don't know at this moment exactly what will happen. The second trial will read out in early 2025, all being well. So if you do the sums from that point, you can imagine that if all goes well in 2025, we might get submission by the end of that year, and then depending on lots of things that we have no control over, you might be seeing this available in the United States sometime, maybe the beginning of 2027. In Europe, in the UK, we're just going to have to see, because much as we talk about registration as a key landmark, the much bigger hurdle is actually reimbursement, particularly in Europe, and you're only halfway there when you get market access in Europe. So I can't answer really your second question. Too political.
No, that's very interesting. I think a lot of members of the public rail against the idea of there being money to make in this field, but of course
we'd love to make some money.
That's a necessary component of the process. So thank you very much. And In May, the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency in the UK, announced that by the end of the first quarter of 2024, they plan to have a framework in place to recognise medicines that have been approved by trusted regulatory partners in a number of territories, so the US, Australia, EU, Japan, I think Switzerland as well. And that sounds to me like it's quite a significant move, but do you think that might change the game in terms of access to these medicines in the UK?
Well, if what it boils down to is that we accept well-conducted studies and well-conducted summaries of analyses of studies from other countries, that's fine. I don't think this is going to offer any kind of shortcut. I mean, if you see what's happened in Australia, we aren't going to adopt the Australian position anytime soon, and I doubt whether many countries will. It's possible, but that's not the intention of this, I think. And I think we have to see how it works out in practice. We don't really know.
And speaking of the Australian decision, so Chris, you flew over last week from Australia, from where at Monash you're involved in the whole drug journey from discovery and preclinical trials all the way through to developing clinical protocols and grappling with policy. And it's been a big week for Australia.
It certainly has. I think it's fair to say that the decision that was taken in February was somewhat unexpected. And the TGA, which is the regulatory body in Australia, took the decision to downschedule psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and MDMA for PTSD from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8 on what's called the poison standard in Australia. So now these are effectively controlled drugs on the level with the likes of ketamine. The TGA has made that decision on the basis of safety and efficacy, but what they've left the sector with is a number of problems and issues to grapple with, which we've been doing very rapidly over the last few months in terms of, well, how does this roll out? An authorized psychiatrist has to be able to prescribe these medicines. It has to be done with the approval of, with human ethics approval. The Royal College of Psychiatrists in Australia and New Zealand has just put out a position piece in terms of recommendations for how this should be done, what kind of psychiatrist should be able to prescribe, what the therapeutic setting needs to be as well. We are still grappling with what are the exact clinical protocols that will be used in this context. And that's before we even get to the issue of things like reimbursement, which is not within the TGA's remit whatsoever. And at the moment, there is no reimbursement available through the Australian healthcare system. So all of this will be essentially have to be privately paid for at this moment in time. And that is not a sustainable situation if we consider our global mission of trying to make these therapies as equitably accessible as possible for the patients that really need them.
And I think you've talked before about how the coming months and weeks and years in Australia, in terms of this specific issue, are a bit like building the boat as we're sailing in it, if I remember rightly.
Yes. Yes, exactly that. So, I mean, there is an awful lot of work ongoing at the moment. We were lucky, or we can say lucky, or we had the foresight at Monash and in partnership with the University of Melbourne and the Florey in Victoria in Australia, that about 18 months ago, I think we saw that this was likely to happen. Not exactly sure of what the timescale was going to be, but it was for this reason that we set up the Neuromedicines Centre in the way that we did, such that we could look at not only preclinical research to pick up on Amir's point from earlier in terms of understanding how these medicines work, and we can talk about the concept of developing next generation medicines as well, but to do manufacturing innovation, to bring sovereign manufacturing to Australia. Access is an issue. To do clinical research, clinical trials. But I think the distinguishing thing that we really wanted to do as well is introduce into that program of work within the centre healthcare economics and indeed policy and behavioural change. How do we actually influence the governments and by governments in Australia, I mean both at the state level and the federal level, how do we bring them along to ensure that they appropriately recognise this type of therapeutic approach and bring it into the healthcare sector in a way that is really going to make a meaningful change?
And you mentioned future medicines or therapies of the future, and you're looking to redefine what treatment for mental health disorders will actually look like in the future. Can you comment a bit on the scope for innovation around existing psychedelic therapies, and particularly on how innovation might actually impact the perception and the legislation around some of these substances?
Absolutely. I'm completely in awe of the work that is currently ongoing in terms of clinical development with Compass and all of the others work that is happening, and seeing the breakthroughs that are being made, the learnings that we're getting. And I find it utterly fascinating, and I find it incredibly encouraging. And to echo Amir's point, I'm a drug discovery person. I've worked in psychiatry for a very long time. I've never been more excited about the prospect of the new medicines that we can bring to fruition. But I am a pharmacologist, I'm a drug discoverer, and my mind is really thinking about what does a mental health therapeutic look like, not now or next year, but in 10 years' time. And I know, can we develop very short-acting, orally bioavailable psychedelic medicines that might give the same kind of effects, but with a shorter duration of action requiring less therapy time? I don't know the answer to that, but until we try to develop those medicines, we won't know. I know it's incredibly divisive within the community, but can we separate a subjective psychedelic experience from a neuroplastic effect? And again, I don't know the answer to that question, but until someone actually develops a drug and takes it through preclinical and clinical development, we won't know the answer to that question. But that's really where my program of work that we're working on at the moment is thinking, and even to, can we develop new medicines that are essentially independent of patient set point around serotonin? We get quite big variability in responses to things like DMT, psilocybin. Can we develop medicines that are able to sort of dial up people's serotonin independently of their own sort of set point? These are all the kind of next generation medicines that we are currently working on within the centre, because I really think that this is the point that we need to be leveraging these wonderful breakthroughs that we're having now and thinking about how do we really shift the needle. We've had no innovation in 50 years in this space, and it is not acceptable.
It's a huge amount of unmet need. David, are you still seeing patients at the moment?
No, we have so many trials going on that I've been given the ability and space to focus on the research, even supported, at least so far, by the NHS that I'm associated with, one of the London trusts called CNWL, where I have some of my salary come from, but we are bringing in some of the Imperial research into the trust, and also offering training opportunities for trainees in the trust, and therefore at the moment I don't see patient outside of the trials.
But I suppose in your career you've witnessed the mountain of unmet need in terms of...
Yeah, so I echo what Chris was just saying, that there's a massive need, and I really echo that not much has happened for several decades, since the 80s, where you have some kind of breakthrough. No, that was a proper breakthrough with the SSRI model, and since then iterations over that recipe, which is fine and well, but still not any proper breakthrough. That this is extremely welcome, deeply appealing to have a pharmacologically induced altered state psychological experience that opens up for, in a way, more individualized intervention. This is about material from people's own psyche. It's not a daily taken SSRI with some, not great, overall in the data effects for depression and other conditions. There are effects, maybe in around a third of the patients respond pretty well, relatively small effects, and then you have the rest, some that respond very little, and a lot that actually do not respond at all, even though you change around the different medications. So there's a big open field for new paradigms like this one is obviously it's not new because it has existed and exists in different cultures. That was the first era, but it is new in the context of Western medicinal model, and the beautiful sort of meeting point between psychology and pharmacology in this model, I think, is very welcomed. The awareness and the attention to context, to the non-pharmacological aspects of this treatment, I think is important. So there is an unmet need, and it's important.
Thank you. I was hoping to ask Charlotte Nichols a couple of questions, but I may as well put them to our esteemed panel. So she spoke publicly about her own difficulties with mental health and the huge unmet needs, and spoke at a debate in the House of Commons about 6 weeks ago, in which she called for an urgent review of the status of psilocybin. And I wanted to know from her what the coffee room chat was among politicians following that debate. We can only speculate, but given that there is a degree of cross-party support for the review of psilocybin, and what I perceive as a significant amount of public enthusiasm, although I'm not sure if anyone's measured that, can we be hopeful that the UK will in fact move forward and take concrete steps to improve access to these very promising medicines?
Don't look at me.
I can't comment on the UK situation, but I can comment from an Australian perspective. And as part of the Neuromedicines Centre work, we actually we've done community surveys, we've done stakeholder surveys to understand attitudes towards the use of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of different mental health disorders. And it's exactly as you say, there is no real effect of political affiliation. There is generally support across the board. The public are supportive. The public are actually supportive of governments funding this kind of research, and especially when they understand and recognize the depth and breadth of the problem. So we were pleasantly surprised at the lack of what you might have considered sort of political opposition that might have been there. And I mean, obviously I can't speak for the UK, but it's not dissimilar in terms of perhaps a cultural attitude. So it would be interesting to see what that plays out like in the UK.
Thank you. And Guy, on that question, I sense some cynicism.
No, not cynicism. I mean, I just don't know what politicians think, and I'm not sure what they do anymore, really. So that was really all I wished to say on that. But, you know, essentially, I think that what we do see is no real barriers to what we're attempting to do through conventional existing pathways to care. And you know, if it works, don't try and fix it. That's quite important.
Did you want to add something, David?
Yeah, maybe because I remember more than a decade ago seeing a talk that Rick Dublin from MAPS gave, where he showed a curve about the US population attitude towards law related to cannabis, and he showed this curve where you could see that you had some early medicinal data coming out, evidence to support a role of these compounds medicinally, and that in a period for a long time before that, you had majority thinking that these drugs should be illegal and fewer thinking they should be legal. And then around the time when these data came out, that started crossing and then crossed. And when Guy says he doesn't know what politicians, who knows what politicians are thinking? However, they typically are thinking down the line where the votes are. So if you have an attitude change in the population that in the cannabis is not a causal thing, but it looked like it probably was related to more and more evidence coming out for medicinal use of these compounds, then attitudes in the population change, and then politicians will definitely also change, and then rules and law and regulations should change. So that's at least how I speculate and imagine that it should and would go. So that they will just follow the mood and attitude in the population, and that will be changing. It is changing due to all the data coming out.
Fantastic, and we can be hopeful. So I hope we have time for a couple of questions. We have a roving microphone, so if you would like to ask the panel a question, please raise your hand. Miriam here at the front.
Thank you. I'm really curious as to what people think the necessary skills, training, qualities of healthcare professionals who might be involved in the actual delivery of such kind of future medications might be. Thank you.
Do you want to comment? I mean, at the moment, we're quite restricted, certainly in the US, to choosing people with basically independent professional qualifications in a range of professions ancillary to medicine. I think the reason for that is simply that the FDA want to kind of maximally incentivize people to behave well in the clinical trials. So it's pretty pragmatic. In the future, I think we will have to see through careful implementation studies what is really required. My own sense is within the NHS, which I know best because I worked there for a long time, I think it would be through psychiatric nurses. I think they're a very appropriate group to work in this. I think they would do a great job with the right kind of training and understanding. And, they're used to working with severely disturbed people, so the psychedelic experience won't freak them out. So I think that's where I sit on this, but, we'll have to see because it's going to be a lot of pressure to save money and to cut corners, and we're going to have to make sure that doesn't happen to an extent that's not safe.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah. So this thing about right now, I guess what Compass and others are working on meaningfully towards is finishing these trials and see whether approval license will be given. And in a way, the psychotherapy element is toned down and stripped down somewhat due to a lot of things having to do with cost, scalability, but also with regulators like the FDA not being equipped or set up to approve that. So in a way, this full proper psychotherapy package that would go beautifully and have done already before the taken into the medicinal model, that is not that much in focus in these trials. So therefore, I think that probably also colors Guy's mention of the nurse. A really experienced, great nurse for mental health would be great in that role. But in a way, does that answer the full question of if you really want to implement it into therapy, which could be done after the approval, then who will be those people to deliver the therapy? That could also be nurses, but then they would need to have a therapist, additional training. So there's a big space, I think, for therapists, psychologists to work in that space around the delivery, pre and post. The nurse may be facilitating, supporting the delivery of the drug, if that makes sense. And my gut feeling is that people who have substantial experience working in mental health, whether it's a nurse in that phase of the delivery or whether it is therapist, psychologist, that substantial experience with complicated, complex presentation cases and therapy will be the ones best suited to implement psychedelics into it, rather than a person with no clinical background, fascinated by psychedelics, wanting to deliver it. I think that could go a bit wrong when you have complex cases.
Thank you. We have time for one last quick question. Gentleman at the back, please.
Hi there, thank you. This is for anyone on the panel. As far as I'm aware, most of the classic psychedelics are also 5-HT2B agonists. And in the recent guidelines from the FDA, there is a section on there that mentions cardiac valvulopathy. And I was just wondering whether anyone who's involved in the psilocybin trials right now have already looked at that, or is that something that you are looking at or potentially in the future? Thank you.
Well, just from our perspective, a single administration is believed widely not to be important from the point of view of this particular complication, which, as you rightly say, is well recognized. I think munching mushrooms on a daily basis is not something that we should be encouraging.
And yet the public is not really aware of that.
No, they aren't. And Chris will have more to say on this in terms of drug development, because obviously this is something you do not really want in your drugs.
Absolutely, for the reason that fen was withdrawn from the market because of that exact problem that you described, cardiac valvulopathy. any new chemical entity that we bring through the traditional regulatory path, we're going to have to demonstrate that if it's not going to be used in this single-dose paradigm, if it's going to be used even as a subchronic or a chronic medicine, whatever that might look like, we will have to be devoid of that activity. It is fundamentally important.
Yeah. And are you doing echo scans, checking out the valves of your patients? Or is there enough established data that the doses you're giving are not causing these problems in trials?
We're doing a conventional preclinical package, safety package.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would echo what Guy also said about these single standing interventions with the full dose. I think we flagged it years ago, and particularly in the review first authored by Kim Kuipers, the issue, but very focused on microdosing, because if people repeatedly take these drugs several times a week for many months, maybe even for years, then it's particularly of interest there to study that. So we encouraged that years ago, and the FDA is in a way doing this here, and I think that's deeply important. So I would say particularly people who are developing repeated dosing paradigms, microdosing in particular, has been encouraged for years. And I don't know, I hope some of those companies who are driving that agenda and those programs are doing it. I know that some microdosing trials are taking in some echo into the trial designs, which is meaningful, but there could be done different preclinical work that would be important to establish it further. So it's an important thing.
Thank you. And that's all we have time for. Thank you very much indeed to all my panel guests.